session we're about to have is with, on my left, Dr. Alex Wodak, a certainly well-known person. He's in terms of the drug law reform movement and the harm reduction movement. Alex, many of you will know him. Most of you will know him. It's a long, long story. But Alex has been involved in drug law reform stuff since the 1980s, for goodness sake, with being involved in the first needle exchange, very, very unofficial, very frowned upon, and all sorts of difficulties. But back in the early 80s, mid-80s, when there was a crisis around AIDS and how that was affecting communities, and the ridiculousness of prohibition having another manifestation, I suppose. But ever since then, Alex has been at the forefront of drug law reform in Australia and internationally. He's the current president of the Drug Law Australian, I'll get the name right, the Australian Drug Law Reform Foundation, and also president of the International Harm Reduction Association. So a person of great substance. We're seriously honoured to have him once again at MardiGrass, not the first time. Not his first rodeo at MardiGrass, or we're always pleased to see him again. So Alex is going to speak today, talk today on his particular topic is, what has to happen to achieve a well-regulated, if I can say, recreational and medicinal cannabis regime in Australia. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I'm sitting here on the stage and I've got this bright light shining into my eyes and I can't see the audience, and in a way that's a terrific metaphor for cannabis prohibition in Australia. The flaws in cannabis prohibition in Australia, the failure of it, the futility of it are so obvious and have been obvious to everyone in this room for so long, and yet we don't seem to make much progress despite heroic efforts by an increasing number of people over many years. We have made some progress, and I'll talk about what that involves. Now, I had a dream, famous few words from Martin Luther King. My dream was a little bit different, and my dream is that I was going to hear an announcement that the Nimbin MardiGrass has been cancelled and will never be held again. And the reason for that is that we have succeeded in achieving all of our aims for both medicinal and recreational cannabis in Australia. So that's my dream. And I'd also have a similar dream for the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras, that they had achieved all their aims. There was no more discrimination, stigmatization, persecution, prosecution, and for that reason the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras was also cancelled. Wouldn't that all be wonderful? Now, I want to give you a message of hope, because it's very important in these dark decades to cling on to hope, and hope is really a very reasonable proposition I would put to you. And the hope that I would give you comes from an economics advisor to President Richard Nixon, Herb Stein, who no longer alive, who used to say that things that can't go on forever don't. And when you think about cannabis prohibition, it is so ridiculous. It only makes sense in one way, which I'll identify in a minute, but in every other way, cannabis prohibition is an utter failure and is futile. And the way in which cannabis prohibition makes sense was revealed by Watergate conspirator John Ehrlichman in a book by Dan Boehm, who interviewed the major figures in the US war on drugs. And when Ehrlichman came out of prison for his Watergate crimes, which were very considerable, he was summoned to Capitol Hill for a congressional inquiry, and he was asked whether the war on drugs is effective. And he was astonished by the question, and he said, well, when I was in the White House advising President Nixon, the war on drugs was just a political strategy. It wasn't seen as a policy. And it's unfortunate that the people who came after me to work in the war on drugs, they thought that the war on drugs really was a policy, not just a political strategy. So he was one of the main figures who began the war on drugs in 1971 to help President Nixon get re-elected in 1972, faced as he was then with the albatross of the Vietnam War dragging him down. The whole proposition has been lost, that side of things. Now, the other side of this that I wanted to bring to your attention, to give you some hope, is what happened in Hungary on April the 12th. And what happened in Hungary was that Viktor Orban, who had been in power, a terrible leader for 16 years, was overthrown in a national election, despite the fact that he had spent those 16 years entrenching himself in power and in the most appalling, shameless way, overriding democracy, and yet he was overthrown. And that must give us hope with every forthcoming election, particularly the elections coming up in November in the United States, in Israel in October, and other elections around the world. Now, it's worth reading up about what tricks Viktor Orban got up to in Hungary, but the fact is, when it came to the elections, people had worked so hard, so intensively at the local level, and the authoritarian government of Orban was overthrown. So why can't we do the same in Australia, be encouraged by that, stimulated by that, enthused by that? It's politics at the local level that really makes a difference. So people like us talking to our politicians, talking to our newspapers, talking to the media, using social media, doing whatever we can, that's what really matters. And I think that's the message that's come out of the Nimbin MardiGrass for the last 34 years, and we haven't really managed so far to put that into practice, as our friends and colleagues have in the United States, where there's been much more progress than we've been able to achieve. We now have popular opposition increasing in Australia to our laws on recreational cannabis, our prohibition of recreational cannabis. A quick word about the history. These laws were introduced. This is on recreational cannabis. It's a long story. I won't go into all the details of that. It actually begins with a trade imbalance from China in the 16th and 17th century, when China was exporting tea, porcelain, silk from the rest of the world and was importing next to nothing. And so a huge trade imbalance built up. And that ended up with India then retaliating by exporting, against the wishes of the Chinese, exporting opium to China, and that helped the incoming British colonial powers. As I say, I won't go into the details of all this. Do read it up, it's really interesting. And then we had a series of meetings which began in Shanghai in 1911, and then there were a series of meetings after the Shanghai meeting, including an all-important meeting in Geneva under the League of Nations in 1925 that Australia was represented at. And the United States was present at that meeting as an observer, but appears to have more or less run the meeting. So that meeting was 101 years ago. And then we began in Australia, state by state, territory by territory, passing laws prohibiting cannabis, and our laws in New South Wales date from 1935, and ultimately the whole country was covered in these laws that were never based on any science or observations. They were based on at the League of Nations meeting in 1925, they were based on the protests of the Egyptian delegation, who argued that too many Egyptian men were mad. Most Egyptian men smoked a lot of cannabis. Therefore, cannabis must be the cause of their madness. Please help us by adding cannabis to the other two plants, the opium poppy and the coca plant, from which cocaine is derived. And so the three plants were prohibited in 1925, and then that system spread throughout the world and was intensified every few years, 3 international treaties, and then the final twist in this whole elaborate structure was the declaration of war on drugs by President Nixon in 1971, which was hugely significant politically. Nixon won 49 of the 50 states in the 1972 presidential elections, and almost all observers thought that that war on drugs had contributed a great deal to Nixon's victory. So that's the background to everything that Steve and David were saying this morning. If you came at 10 o'clock, if you're up that early to hear their legal briefing, excellent it was, and I think it'll be repeated again, and is well worth hearing.
11 o'clock tomorrow.
11 o'clock
Same
tomorrow.
place.
So do listen to that, it's well worth hearing. So that's the background, and in our local terms, this development, this story had a twist, another twist in 10 years ago, this year in 2016, when Lucy Haslam and others managed to get the House of Representatives and the Senate to allow medicinal cannabis. So we've had 10 years of medicinal cannabis. We now have 41% of Australians, a larger number than of people now support reform of cannabis, support cannabis decriminalisation, a larger number than support cannabis criminalisation. And then 3 years later, the National Drug Strategy Household Survey was repeated, and that number went up from 41 to 44%. I do want to remind you that Nate Silver, who's a very significant pollster in the United States, had predicted that the drive towards decriminalisation of cannabis wouldn't happen on a significant level in the United States until support for decriminalisation reached 60%, and his projection turned out to be astonishingly accurate, and now the number is well over 70% in the Gallup poll, and state by state is slowly decriminalising cannabis, or regulating cannabis, I should say, in the United States. That's recreational cannabis as well as medicinal cannabis. And over 50% of the states and well over 50% of the population are represented in the states that have already decriminalised cannabis, and a higher number of states have made medicinal cannabis legal in the United States. And we have about, I think, somewhere over a dozen countries have now regulated recreational cannabis. So there's a lot of hope here. Now, what we have in Australia is a real dog's breakfast in terms of our laws for recreational cannabis and for medicinal cannabis. And I think it's important, before you start being too severe in your criticisms of what we've got, to remember that when anybody starts doing something for the first time, there's almost always a major learning curve, as there is for regulating medicinal cannabis and regulating recreational cannabis. I would also put it to you, and it's important to remember this, that, in my view at least, that even the worst form of regulation of medicinal cannabis or recreational cannabis or both, even the worst form is still better than the best form of drug prohibition, whatever that might be. Drug prohibition really is a mess. It doesn't work except in one sense, and that is politically. Remember also that while we quite rightly in Australia these days, in recent years, have started to recognise the shamefulness, the national shame of our disposition and our other appalling treatment of First Nations Australians. Don't forget that when it comes to prohibition, they only prohibited alcohol in the United States for 12 years. We prohibited in Australia the prohibition of alcohol for over 100 years, but only for Indigenous Australians. And the failure of that, the futility of that was obvious for many years. And then slowly in the 1970s, state by state started knocking that off. I wouldn't say the regulation of alcohol for Indigenous Australians has been a huge success, but the prohibition of alcohol for Indigenous Australians was even worse, and of course it was blatantly racist. So here we are, we've got medicinal cannabis, but we haven't really. We've got an appalling system of regulation. I want to remind you that cannabis is a very complicated drug. It's not a straightforward drug. It has over 100 psychoactive ingredients in it, and that in itself makes studying the science of medicinal cannabis extremely complicated. There's still a debate about whether there is a so-called entourage effect, and that is to say whether those 100 psychoactive ingredients interact with one another or whether they are independent. That's not yet resolved. The other thing I think we don't emphasise nearly enough is that we are suffering in 2026 around the world from the fact that we missed out on 30 or 40 years of good science on studying medicinal cannabis. And the reason we missed out on that is quite simply it was seen to be irreconcilable with the war on drugs. So there's a lot, if there hadn't been that prohibition of, almost was a prohibition of research on medicinal cannabis, that was the effect of it anyway, if not the intent. If we had 30 or 40 years more science on medicinal cannabis, we would be a lot further ahead in understanding it, and it's very complicated. And if we had better knowledge of it, I'm sure that would help us to understand how to better frame the laws. The practical impact of that is that there is very little standardization of cannabis, both from the point of view of studies, biological studies of the medicinal effects of cannabis, and that complicates the problem for legislators coming up with trying to get good laws around medicinal cannabis. So we have a situation where we have a lot of poorly regulated telehealth, which makes it easy for customers or consumers or patients, whatever you want to call them. Life is quite difficult for doctors who operate outside the telehealth system, operate within a clinical context, and it's very confusing and very difficult for patients. So medicinal cannabis has a long way to go in Australia, undoubtedly. I'd point to the fact that almost every jurisdiction, every country where medicinal cannabis started, it took a long while to sort out the problems with medicinal cannabis. We're experiencing that still, and so I'm confident that things will get better. I don't know how quickly that'll happen, but I think it is going to happen. But with recreational cannabis, we're much further behind. I certainly had the hope that, as in California, where the regulation of medicinal cannabis, the legalization of medicinal cannabis in California, was soon followed by equivalent changes with recreational cannabis. That hasn't really happened in Australia except in one jurisdiction, the ACT, with a population of less than 500,000 people. So we have a lot of work to do there, and I'm sure everyone in this room would like to see the 6 states, 2 territories, and most important of all, the Commonwealth, change the laws completely. That's where we have to end up. The law has been, on recreational cannabis, have been made less severe than they used to be. I think that's true, but still far too many people caught up in the criminal justice network, and that is very, very damaging. And what we don't emphasise nearly enough is that the laws on that when someone has had some interaction with the criminal justice system over cannabis, it has huge effects on them, which lasts for years. And we had an excellent comparison study of South Australia and Western Australia when Western Australia still had a highly criminalised system, and South Australia had softened its laws a lot, and it was very clear that the people caught up in that net in Western Australia had huge impacts on their personal life. Many broke up relations with their significant other people. They lost their accommodation, lost their jobs, and it didn't affect their cannabis consumption at all. So we have a huge system that is not working and that has flow-on effects, including on the roadside drug testing, a uniquely Australian nonsense based on voodoo science that we should be getting rid of as soon as possible. So I'm going to stop there, Steve, and we'll open it up for questions, because that's where the work will get done.
Certainly. Thank you, Alex. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, so we'll see how we go. There's probably not nearly enough time.
If you don't mind, more like 5, Steve.
Sorry?
About
That's
5
better.
minutes
Sorry.
for questions. About 5 minutes
5
for
minutes for questions, sorry. We have less time than we thought. 5 minutes for questions. So we'll see how many we can fit into that time. We need more than that, of course. But anyway, yes, if people could please put your hand up. It is difficult to see people from where I am, but that's the number, we'll find you. And please ask the question into the microphone, otherwise no one else will hear you. The person next to you will, but no one else will. So wait for the mic. And the first question is from...
We're coming towards you.
And hold the microphone like you hold an ice cream.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll start licking it. The main question I'd like you to talk about, Dr. Wodak, is that the main opposition to drug law reform comes from the police. They've got control of drugs policy, and they don't want to surrender it. They make, I don't know what the cost of drug law enforcement is in Australia, but it would be in somewhere between 3 billion and 4 billion. Drug law enforcement just operates as a multiplier for the cannabis market. You can multiply what they spend on drug law enforcement. Look, this was up until legalisation, and I haven't done any research since then. But before that, you could just multiply what was drug law enforcement and you'd get to the cost, the size of the market. So the question is, what do we do about the police?
Well, that's a very good question, and the perspective I would give to you is a historical one. We have had a lot of prohibitions in Australia, as the rest of the world has as well, and one by one they do get knocked off. So when I was a young boy, we still prohibited off-course betting. So you could bet on horse races if you went to a race course, but outside a race course, it was illegal to bet on horse racing. And the result of that was rampant prohibition, and eventually that was gotten rid of. We had abortion was illegal throughout Australia, and that was gotten rid of. And while abortion was the law, there was rampant corruption of police. We had a prohibition on male to male sex, and that prohibition was gotten rid of, beginning with the after the police in Adelaide threw a law lecturer into the River Torrens and drowned him in May 1972. Never charged, never prosecuted, never convicted, I might say. And if you, the voluntary assisted dying was also prohibited, and that's a prohibition that has recently been knocked off. Same-sex marriage was prohibited. There wasn't corruption about that. But what I'm getting at is prohibitions really do have a limited lifespan, and we know that this prohibition is going to end. There's an inevitability about it. You're absolutely right that the industrial aspects of drug prohibition are prolonging the life of drug prohibition. There's no doubt about it, and roadside drug testing, I'm sure, falls into that category as well. What can we do about it? Well, I think my answer to that would be two words: Viktor Orban. If the Hungarians could throw out Viktor Orban, despite 16 years of him entrenching himself into Hungarian politics, then I think eventually, if we are active enough at the local level, we will get there. So these laws are made ultimately by politicians, and they can only be repealed by politicians. It's the politicians who have to hear from every one of us in this room that this isn't working, and they have to hear that by us asking for meetings to see them, and if that can't happen, then we write to them or ring their office. We write letters to the editor of our newspapers. We get active on social media. We have events like the Nimbin MardiGrass. And eventually that will win. We've seen this all over the world. This is the way to change bad laws.
Thank you. There was one question with a long answer, but I think, in fairness, the answer covered a fair number of fields. So, well, look, we are running very short of time. Unless there's a burning question from somebody, I can't see any. No. Look, we'll call it that. We'll get on to the next speaker. So, look,
I'm happy to answer questions in the street if you want.
Yes. Exactly. So Alex will be at MardiGrass for the rest of the day, I think, anyway, certainly for a while. So pigeonhole him, grab him and have a conversation by all means. He's a very willing conversationalist, I'll tell you that. So thank you once again, Alex. That was remarkably clear and comprehensive.